Right, we'll just get started in like 1 minute, Raymond. Don't look at that. What the clock there? It's leaving. We've got anyone else? No, not. Pretty good.
Look at that. Yes, it's 3:15. Time to go.
It's probably not that time anywhere.
No. It could be in common, perhaps.
Okay, let's get started. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to. I have already pushed record. Oh, there's nothing happening. Is it not recording? Okay. Welcome to today's seminar. I'm Josephine Johnson. I'm Associate Professor here in the Bioethics Centre at the University of Otago, and I'm going to chair the seminar today. The Bioethics Seminar series runs every Monday, generally from 1 to 2 p.m. We'll be making a tiny exception today. I'll explain in a second. New Zealand time, and it features local, national, and international speakers addressing a wide variety of topics within bioethics. And you're invited to attend in person or over Zoom, so we can make this an international event. If you would like to be added to our mailing list, please let us know at bioethics@otago.ac.nz. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to take a minute for some housekeeping. So if you're on Zoom, please remember to keep yourself muted during the presentation so as not to disrupt the speaker. This seminar actually will go for 50 minutes today because Neil is teaching at 2 o'clock, so we will run until 1:50 p.m. Questions and discussions are always an important part of our seminars, so the speaker will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes and then we'll turn over to questions from you, the audience. If you're on Zoom and you've got a question for our speaker, you're welcome to put your question in the chat, type your question into the chat, and we will turn to it in the question time. If you prefer to ask your question verbally, you can use the raise hand function during the Q&A period, and we will look at that online and we will call on you. And if you're in the seminar room, of course, you're welcome to just raise your hand and we'll call on you directly. So now it's my pleasure to hand it over to today's speaker, my colleague here at the University of Otago, Associate Professor Neil Pickering. Neil, his research focuses on conceptual questions that inform the ethics of mental health care and policy, particularly regarding decision-making capacity and competence assessments, and we'll be speaking about an issue related to that today. So over to you, Neil.
Thanks, Josie. Kia ora koutou. Ko Neil Pickering, I hope. That's Josie. That's just said. And thanks very much, Josie, for the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. Actually, I've got to get not to a teaching thing at 2, but to a learning thing at 2, where I am the student. So I daren't be late for that. Anyway, I'm getting a taste of my own medicine at the moment. All right. So I'm just going to share the screen. Where's the share screen?
It's in green.
Green one.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, I should know that by now, shouldn't I? I'm going to share the screen. Hopefully, once I've done that, you can all see my title slide. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. Problems with internalism. And as you can see, I've accredited to myself, and I shall explain why in a minute, or why. Here we go. Right. So here's what I intend to try to do today. So first of all, I'm going to do some background stuff. The idea is to locate what I'm doing in the wider context, both in the current New Zealand context and in the context of research, which myself and colleagues of mine have been doing over the past 4 or 5 or perhaps more years. Then in order to get into the subject, I'm going to start off by looking at some critics of a position which I have taken up in the past. Before coming to the question which I really want to ask today, which is whether internalists, as I shall call them, can do competence. In other words, can they give us any account of decision-making competence within the ambit of their own approach to decision-making? And then I shall come to a conclusion, which is broadly not the way they're going at the moment. They can't. But there are, of course, ways forward, which internalists can select, and I'll offer them a few. And who knows, we may actually try to do some for them at some point.
It might just, if you click, it might be.
Maybe it will just click for them. Oh, okay. So let's start off with a bit of the sort of context for why anybody might be interested in research into competence and capacity, particularly right now here in New Zealand. So there's a couple of things, or three things to note, I think. So first of all, if you look around recent developments in the New Zealand law, most obviously, for instance, in the End of Life Act, you will find that a cognitive framework for assessing decision-making capacity has started to appear in the New Zealand law. Now, the definitive account of this framework is being created by my colleague, Professor John Macmillan, and some colleagues of his. And it's not only in that End of Life Bill Act that you will find it, but also in other places. The only thing to note in terms of that framework for assessing capacity, and the one I'm going to be looking at today, is the one I'm looking at today originates in the US, and the one that is being used here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, originates in the UK. But there is reasonable, there is reason to think that the two basically cover the same field, the same domain, while doing it in slightly different ways. In addition, here in New Zealand, right at the moment, there is a movement to reform our mental health and capacity laws, about which Josie and other health law colleagues will know much more than myself. But under the previous government, the cabinet accepted a paper which, if it's ever acted upon, will mean the replacement of the current mental health legislation, our Mental Health Act 1992. What exactly it will be replaced with is an interesting question, but probably the front runner for the new way of doing things will be a capacity-based approach. So our mental health laws currently enable psychiatrists for the mental health, the mental health people on in general to treat people, provided they fit categorically under the description which is used in the Mental Health Act, which doesn't contain any direct reference to capacity. So it's a non-capacity test. And if that is replaced by a capacity test, then the new law will look very different. Now, in the background of all this, and significant, although exactly how significant perhaps remains to be seen, is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which is pushing a rights-based approach to mental health legislation. And also, if you take it in a fairly extreme version, is actually claiming that, or can be seen to claim that everybody has some level of capacity. and the only issue is how much support they need to make the decision. Now, that's not accepted by everybody. But again, there's this sort of capacity focus, and also in the UN CRPD, a rights focus. So that's the background of what's actually kind of going on in the real world at the moment. Now, this particular paper, I'm not sure it quite earns the distinction of being a paper. This particular presentation is part of a much larger project, which I'm conducting with my colleague, Simon Walker, sitting over there, and Giles Newton-Howes, a colleague from Wellington. And we've also collaborated over the years of the project with a number of other people. Now, Simon and Giles are not credited on this because they haven't had the chance to say what a load of rubbish it is or correct it. So I'm entirely responsible for this, but it does fit into our larger project. Now, this project has many moving parts, some of them moving slightly more than others. But broadly speaking, it consists of a critique of current accounts of decision-making competence, in particular, the two approaches which are labelled internalism and externalism, and also would like to frame and test an alternative approach, which has all the advantages, whatever they are, and none of the disadvantages of what's currently out there. Now, when it comes to questioning internalism, there are actually a number of quite complex questions to ask. One is, what exactly is internalism? What is it committed to? And whether, given its commitments, it is a coherent position. And given its commitments and its coherence, does it actually offer us an account of competence, which is what it claims to do? Now, the potential problem I'm looking at today is a problem for whether it actually offers an account of competence, so whether it is a successful in what it says it's doing. And this problem arises if we take it to be the case that one of its primary claims is that we should base our competence assessment wholly upon how a decision is made, upon decision-making processes, and the corollary of that is not at all on the decision that actually emerges from that process. So it's the way that you do it, is what this particular claim amounts to. Now, the question that I'm asking is whether internalism is actually doing it at all when it comes to competence. And the claim is that no, they're not, or there seem to be some fundamental problems.
You carry on.
Yeah, sure. Now, to get into this, I'm going to start by pushing back against an article which critiqued an article which myself, Giles, and Greg Young wrote, and which was published in the American Journal of Bioethics. And a word to the wise here: if you want to get loads of citations, write something that everybody hates, including the people who agree with you but don't think you've gone about it the right way. Now, Earp et al.'s critique of our article is an extremely good article in its own right. So a little bit more than a commentary. But I just want to take up one of the things they say about our approach. And this is only one of the things they say. So when Earp and et al. Are considering our approach, which has a sort of externalist feel about it, in other words, it's related to the risks of the choices that people are making, and wants to relate those risks to whether the question of whether or not a person is competent. In questioning what we're up to, Earp et al. Come up with these two cases. Actually, they come up with more cases. But at any rate, they come up with these two. So the first case concerns, it's a made-up case, concerns a Jehovah's Witness who they name Mary, who chooses to refuse a life-saving blood transfusion, but who is ex hypothesi competent on internalist grounds. So her decision-making processes are absolutely fine, but she refuses life-saving blood transfusion, which at least from a kind of outside perspective, a non-Jehovah's Witness perspective, you might think, oh, that looks a bit of a harmful and unwise, a risky choice. The other case that they want to kind of run alongside this is based around someone who they call Carrie, who refuses a life-saving kidney dialysis, but whose thinking is black and white and catastrophist. Now, this isn't made up stuff. This comes from, from our article, but we based that on the judgment of a British judge in the case of someone called C from 2015. C was a person who refused life-saving kidney dialysis and who her psychiatrist described as using black and white and catastrophist thinking. Okay. Now, the question they sort of pose to us is, well, you were probably going to say that the first person is competent and should be allowed to make that choice. Why wouldn't you say the same in the second case? What's the difference between the two, given they're both choosing to refuse life-saving treatment? And I'm not going to read this out, but this is what they specifically say. And the point they want to make, which is not an incorrect point, is that the only difference between the two cases seems to lie in the fact that one of them is not thinking straight, if you like. Their decision-making process has gone wrong. It's rigid, black and white, and catastrophic, whereas the other person's thinking processes are fine. But, they say, surely if this is the only difference between the two cases, then the only difference is an internalist difference. It's not a difference in terms of the harm of their choices. Instead, it's a difference in whether their thinking, their decision-making processes are what et al. Would call defective, epistemically defective. And then, if we were to take that route, we would be internalists. So despite our claim to be externalists, we turn out not to be externalists after all, and everything would hinge on the internalist assessment. Now, what they say of our analysis of the assessment of decision-making capacity is true. So, shock horror, yes. When it comes to trying to find out whether somebody has what level of decision-making capacity they have, we are internalists. We would look at their process. But the point is that when it comes to the harm bit, we don't claim that if you make a harmful decision, your process is somehow worse. We don't think that a harmful decision indicates a lower or reduced capacity. What we do think, and what we think externalists in general think, is that we should demand higher, greater degrees of capacity to make a risky decision. That's what externalists think. And to the extent that Earp et al. And other internalists think that externalists think that harmful decisions are indicate a lower decision-making capacity as completely wrong. They completely misunderstand what externalists are all about. And insofar as that drives their analysis, they don't understand what externalism is all about. Okay, but how does this pushback feed into today's talk? So, just for the sake of argument, we're going to continue to assume that the cognitivist paradigm of decision-making process is the right one. And what we're going to say is you can't go from that. You can't, and we can't, go from an assessment of process to a judgment of competence. So, insofar as you look only at processes, you will never arrive, this is the claim we're making, at anything that looks like a judgment about competence. Okay? I'm going to say that in several different ways and give you reasons for thinking it. So where do we find our reasons? Well, let's go right back to where the first, or at least an early systematic account of the cognitivist approach to decision-making assessment, back to Grissow and Applebaum's work on the McCat-T research project. So this was a huge research project, took place in the US, looking at the questions of the assessment of patients' abilities to make treatment decisions. And it's the McCat stands short for MacArthur research project. And Grissow and Applebaum published a whole bunch of articles based on this in Law and Behavior, in the New England Journal of Medicine, and in Psychiatric Services. Now, this is their model of the cognitivist structure of decision-making, competence, and how you arrive at it. And what you'll notice straight away is that it consists of 4 abilities which collectively feed into the thing in the middle, the idea of competence. Ability here, we can perhaps translate into the term capacity, but ability is fine. So this is the standard US approach, which I mentioned earlier on, the ability to communicate what you want, the ability to understand the information you are given, the ability to appreciate that the situation and its likely consequences, and the ability to, they use the term, manipulate the information rationally. As I said earlier on, actually here in New Zealand, we've taken up the British approach in the Mental Capacity Act 2005. But I think there is good reason to think they are formally pretty much the same thing. That one can make an argument about it. No? Now, when it comes to assessing those 4 things, the decision, the tool which Grissow and Applebaum and some of their colleagues developed is delivered in the course of informing a patient and actually trying to make a decision. So the tool kind of runs alongside the actual business of clinical communication at a point where a person is actually making a decision about an actual treatment. And they ask questions related to each of those 4 domains. And here's how they explain what the questions are that they ask. Now, this is not a list of the actual questions, but this is what those questions assess specifically. As you can see, they ask questions which explore the person's understanding, which basically requires the person to paraphrase the information back to them. They explore the person's reasoning. Do they do consequential thinking? Do they think about the outcomes of their choices? Do they compare the outcomes? Do they, in some cases, come up with novel outcomes, ones that the clinicians haven't thought of? And then is the whole thing explanatorily adequate? Does it explain the choice they actually come up with? And then there's a question of whether they can actually make a choice, which is the most easily assessed, because they simply have to state a preference in order to meet that criteria. And then they have these whole set of questions about appreciation, which asks, for instance, whether they acknowledge that the information they've been provided is actually about them, whether they're the subject of the whole thing, or whether they deny that, or whether they appreciate that the proposed treatment could have some benefit for them. The appreciation of treatment benefit subscale. Now they go from this to do some, they fill in this form on the McCat T record form. T stands for treatment. And they then rate the quality of response to each of the sub-questions they ask in those general domains. And they rate the patient's responses as 2 adequate, 1 partial, and 0 inadequate. And in order to help the clinicians decide whether the response is adequate, partial, or inadequate, they have examples and things which help guide them. And then they say this: the method provides summary ratings for each capacity, each ability, 0 to 6 for understanding, so they can score up to 6, and as little as 0 for their understanding, 0 to 4 for their appreciation, 0 to 8 for their reasoning, and 0 to 2 for expressing a choice. And then they go on to say, no overall McCat treatment tool rating is calculated. No specific summary rating on the 4 capacities is regarded as representing competence or incompetence. All the ratings do is to identify a degree of capacity or deficiency in the relevant abilities. And these, as they say, then have to be weighed along with other clinical and contextual information to arrive at judgments about competence in individual cases. Okay, so what does this imply for the internalists? So the claim I'm going to make is that this should tell the internalists that they cannot move from a process-based assessment of decision-making capacity to any assessment of whether or not the person is capable of making the decision. Now, why? So why is this? There are 2 reasons. First of all, we get no overall capacity score. We remain with 4 independent scores. They're never conglomerated into a single capacity score. And secondly, because they're assessing capacity, they aren't assessing competence, which is something different. So why do we get no overall capacity score? Well, apart from the fact, well, the main reason is that the 4 tests are regarded as independent. And this is partly because of where they come from. They don't seem to have any shared feature or characteristic which they all kind of ask questions about. It's absolutely not clear what weight each of those 4 abilities should carry, either in the abstract or in any particular case. It's not clear that understanding is more important in some cases, or reasoning, or whatever. And it's absolutely not clear either, if you score badly on one of them, whether you can kind of make up that on another one, or whether this is not possible. So this is why they don't end up with any single capacity score. Now, competence is not assessed, and they say this openly, that none of the summary scores tells you whether on that particular area of assessment they have reached some score that they have to reach in order to be regarded as competent. And the reason for this is plain to see, and that is that this tool measures what the person is capable of doing in terms of decision making, but it doesn't measure, obviously doesn't measure, what they need to be able to do to be classed as competent. So I think we can generalize from this, and there are other examples, but this is the kind of locus classicus. So the problem here, I think, in general, is that it doesn't matter how well you measure a person's decision-making capacity, if you were, or their capacity in relation to the independent aspects of decision-making, all you end up with is a measure of the degree of their capacity. And that, how well you do something in terms of some kind of excellent, average, poor, mediocre, whatever you want to say, none of that is conceptually the same as stating you need to be at this level of capacity in order to be competent. Competence requires you to be able to understand to this degree or appreciate to this degree or whatever. Of course, you can express the competence standard, the required degree of capacity, as a degree of capacity. You could say it lies here. You have to meet this score, but you can't derive it just from measuring capacity. Now, I'm just generalizing what Applebaum and Grissow said here, and that is undoubtedly what they think, and I think they're right. So, I want to conclude at this point. I think that thus far, the internalists, those who focus only on process, have not provided a basement for the assessment of competence. You might say, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it, provided you do it, and they're not. How could they move forward? And, you know, this is not something necessarily for them. This is part of our wider project. Whilst one thing they could do is to show how you can move forward from capacity to competence. Perhaps I've just missed it. It's just obvious. Or perhaps they could find another way, an alternate way of assessing competence, which is nonetheless internalist in some sense or other. Or they could abandon competence assessment altogether and say you can never make an assessment of competence, although you can go ahead confidently making assessments of capacity. And this might fit in with some of the more extreme interpretations of the UNCRPD. So that is my conclusion now. In the abstract, there was me saying, oh, I'm going to do a whole bunch of other stuff. But because I've got to leave early, and because in any case, it always takes long to do these things, and you think I'm not going to attempt to do the other half. So that is a pleasure for another day. Leave them wanting more. That's what I say. Okay, kia ora koutou.
So Neil and I are going to co-manage the questions. Primarily, I'm going to pull up.
Do you want to get rid of the share? Yeah, just stop share, the red one.
Yeah.
That's good.
So anyone on Zoom who wants, there isn't anything in the chat right now. So has anyone on Zoom got a question? Raise your hand. But we can also just start there from the room if you want, and I'll keep it on the
Sure.
Zoom.
First hand up is Mike.
Thanks, Neil. So I've got, I think, is well, both of them may be fairly simple, but and one of them was on the slides, but it was referring to the slides. But you had, looking at the, at that capacity scale, the way of assessing it, said there wasn't any single quality that they were all pointing to.
Yeah.
Isn't that clearly false? They're all aiming towards capacity, and that's the single quality. Or am I missing something?
Yeah, you would have thought, wouldn't you, that these are all measures of one thing, that thing being capacity, which
Or they're aiming at parts of it, and they're collectively sufficient or something like that, or they're collectively able to give you an assessment of it. I just couldn't see what
of it.
they seem to be aimed, it being capacity, just seemed to me like that was, so I thought maybe I was missing something there.
I just don't see, I mean, we can say that, they can say that. Oh yes, this is an assessment of capacity. Capacity is made up of these four things. And I suppose I'd be inclined to say that's possible because capacity could be made up of four things that somehow relate to this further imaginary thing. But, that's just saying stuff.
The imaginary thing being
Capacity itself,
capacity, yeah.
you can.
Well, I mean, you'd have to provide some account of it, but it just seems to me like if I was assessing something like a kiwi fruit, for example.
Yeah.
It's kiwi fruit picking season. I might go, well, there's the shape part, there's the color part, there's the taste part, there's the size part or something like that. And collectively, all of these will give me some assessment of the kiwi fruit as a whole. And that seems a perfectly reasonable thing to say. So that's, and so,
I can see the kiwi fruit. And I can see how each of those is clearly inheres in the kiwi fruit in some way.
Yeah.
But I don't see any
so
equivalent
you
here.
couldn't do it with any abstraction.
Well, you can't,
Any
I mean, you can presume or assume that these four independent things are all aspects of one thing. But just assuming it doesn't demonstrate.
Yeah.
And we're,
So perhaps it's one way forward for the internalists, at least in that respect, to provide some account of why these collectively do some to the
it won't get them to competence, but they could do that. Insofar as the externalists also rely on this process-based assessment, they have the same problem. This is not a problem which we can annex to internalism. It's a problem for anybody who wants to proceed from these four things to some supposed one thing, which they're all supposed to be somehow aspects of. By the way, I'm not just saying, no, they're not. At least I don't think I am. I'm just saying, just show me. Simon.
It was
I think for us.
Oh, sorry, Grant.
Well, I'm just aware that philosophically, when one is faced by a contradiction, the two axioms of which both independently seem to be true, what you have to do is transcend it. And in this case, I think you have to transcend what we conceive of as consent by going to a constructive and mutually respectful conversation between patient and therapist. And that, I think, undercuts the apparent dilemma and does so in a way that is realistic and that it relates to everyday discursive life in conversational implicatures, to bring in two other philosophical concepts.
Well, thanks, Grant. And kind of two responses to that. The first is that's exactly what we're looking at doing. Right at the start, I said, we're looking at problems with the offerings we are given, but wondering whether there is some better third option. And, I don't know whether it was Wittgenstein or somebody else who said, if you've got two positions and neither of them are very good, they probably share something that you don't like, and that's what you want to get rid of. The other thing I would like to just respond to is, I think that your move is towards a process.
Yes.
And I think that's fair enough in practical terms. The problem is whether the process makes conceptual sense. That's our question. Now, it might be that you have a wonderful process and actually everybody's totally happy with it. But when you look at it, what's it actually attempting to achieve? You might start scratching your head. Now, you might say, oh, that's a philosopher's problem. They would scratch their head about something that nobody else is bothered about. And I think the process move is quite reasonable and quite well established. And so I wouldn't want to stop that as part of, the reforms, for instance, in New Zealand.
The deeper point is moving from reality to representation, which you do when you abstract to form your elements, conceptual elements in a process, seems to be where the problem is, because every move from reality to representation involves abstraction, and all abstractions are tendentious.
So I'm a realist about a lot of stuff.
Realism is, of course, very tendentious.
Pardon? Pardon?
Realism is very tendentious.
It is, but it's much.
One can be a representational realist or a existential realist.
Yeah, you can
And
be.
they're quite different.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure what I am. However, the claim that once you move to representation, you somehow have lost contact with something, reality, is not one I accept.
And neither would be.
Yeah. So it depends on what you get, so he was a realist of a special kind.
And it's self-modifying.
Yeah. But so I don't necessarily accept the metaphysics of what you're saying. I'm not quite clear where I stand on it. And to me, abstraction is not an ultimate problem.
You don't have any questions online yet, but I know that Simon is eager to ask a question.
Thank you. Thanks, Grant. Mike, I don't think I can be as interesting today. I do have a thread though that so with your kiwi fruit example, Mike, there will always be a context in which one would conduct this examination, which would give a sense to what we're trying to do. Probably how good is this kiwi fruit, right? So there's an evaluation going on, and we would have an understanding of what we're looking for. Possibly with Grant's move to a conversation, eventually with a consensually constructed conversation, the value is we need to get somewhere, that everyone would think was a good idea, or ideally. I suppose the problem with the conversation around this is that we might have lost track of what the question was for, but I doubt that it's that bad. So with regards to what Applebaum and Grisso did, didn't they claim that they had validated their tool against something, which I believe was clinical judgment, like a lot of these tools about, they took the experts and said, would you agree with what the tool has generated?
Oh, they probably did do something like that. I haven't.
But because this whole area is quite under-theorized, it is just turning on judgments. intuitive judgments that people are making. Is this person competent, yes or no? And what we probably didn't fully think through was how much are we building into that of other things as well, such as the consequences. And it seems to me that they have actually swung in their position on this one.
Yeah, I think they have too. So if you go back and you look at their New England Journal of Medicine
Yeah.
article, they say all that stuff that their tool creates, valid or not, is only part of the judgment. And then you've got to bring society in. And amongst the things society will decide is the balance between allowing people to make decisions it regards as harmful,
yeah,
and decisions that they regard as wonderful, or at any rate, or perhaps, actually, I don't think internalists should say that, but they do. But, you know, which, and where, you know, where you're going to set the cutoff. So if, you know, I guess they're saying is if society is happy for people to be risk takers the whole time, take huge kinds of risks, they're going to set the capacity standards very low. So, you know, pretty much anybody who says, I want this, gets it, because that's the only question that matters. You might say, if you set the standards really low, if you set them really high, you've got a very sort of protectionist, risk-averse society, then you might have to score really well. You might have to understand really well, and so on and so forth. So they say that in 1989 or whenever they wrote that NEJM article, but in a recent commentary on something that we wrote, specifically this article, they seem to have changed their tune. I think that's what you're referring to.
Oh, well, there's an intermediate point where they sound like more standard externalist.
Yeah, no, yeah.
Anyway.
They've never formalized what that amounts to.
It's just interesting to observe how much of this is just trading on tuitions. And,
Yeah.
and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean,
And
it's sort of,
it's the possible move to say, here's the definitive account.
yeah,
That would be the ultimate.
yeah, definitive account of whatever it is. Of the Kiwi fruit. I'm prepared to accept the account of the Kiwi fruit.
I think we could have a very quick question from the floor or from.
Oh, just a remark, I'm currently just finished reading a book on love and death and the Third Reich. And it is clear from that if you put certain choices to Germans who were very Christian and very patriotic at the beginning of the war and the end of the war, they would have come up with very different solutions. And therefore, existentialists stress what happened in the middle, the touch of the real, the 2K.
Well, yeah, I think though, actually, Applebaum and Grissow have done some reasonable stuff with that, because this isn't a research project in the normal sense of, you know, let's go into a situation we've created. Instead, they were talking to people who are actually having to make these decisions. So I think there was a kind of touch of the real, not quite as existentially dramatic as the one you're talking about.
Thank you so much, Neil. Let's give Neil a big round of applause. I'm just trying to stand beside you for a second here to just let everybody know that there is no seminar next week. So next week, the university students are all out. We're not going to be here on next Monday. It's Easter Monday, so we will not be having one, but we will have one the week after next. So on the 8th of April, we have a presenter joining us from over Zoom from Canada, Matthew McCurry, who is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, speaking about patient participation in clinical encounters. And the question he's asking or going to be addressing is, are clinical practice guidelines promoting an evidence-based paternalism? So you're very welcome to join this seminar. We will all be gathered here Matt will be presenting from Zoom, so you're also welcome to join on Zoom. And if you want to be added to our mailing list, just email us at bioethics@otago.ac.nz. Thank you very much. Thank you, Neil.
Thanks,
I hope you get to
Josie.
class on time.
Yes, I won't be late. The teacher won't criticise me.